Okay, guys, welcome back, Seekers for Truth. This is the panel that will answer all the questions you possibly had about trust, but throw up more so you can look forward to a set of great presentations. I'm very happy to have these three colleagues here who accepted our invitation. The first I will briefly introduce is Paul Faulkner, and it is no exaggeration to say that he is one of the most important and widely read philosophers working on the philosophical analysis of trust, whether it is the moral aspects, the epistemic aspects, the political aspects. He is truly a great authority on these issues and someone whose work I have benefited from a lot. Let me mention a few of his publications, which are trust related. There's Knowledge on Trust with Oxford University Press, published 10 years ago. More recently, in 2017, he edited, together with Thomas Simpson, a brilliant collection of articles. One he has in there himself. The collection is called The Philosophy of Trust. His papers have been published in the best philosophical journals on Telling and Trusting in Mind, The Practical Rationality of Trust in Synthese, The Moral Obligation of Trust in Philosophical Explorations, Finding Trust in Government in the Journal of Social Philosophy. More recently, Lockdown, a case study in how to lose trust and undermine compliance. The title of his talk today couldn't be more fitting. It is simply Trust and Conflict. Great to have you here, Paul.
Thank you. So the title of the talk is fitting because it's designed just for this conference. And what I want to do is essentially I want to outline some of my thinking about the nature of trust and then apply it to conflict, although the application to conflict will be fairly brief. The main conclusions that I want to draw is, first of all, a conclusion which is sympathetic to ConTrust, which says that conflict is consistent with trust. But I also want to draw a conclusion which is unsympathetic to ConTrust, which is that conflict is a basis for distrust rather than for trust. Obviously, you can recognize that conflict can't be consistent with trust and yet at the same time be a basis for distrust rather than trust, and those two claims are contradictory. But I think that what they just illustrate is that there's different ways of thinking about trust in play. And if we can tease apart these ways of thinking about trust, I think that's a necessary starting point for working out how trust and conflict engage with one another. Okay, so let's start off very briefly with, oops, that's meant to be animated. My apologies that it's one splurge. Let's start very briefly with asking what is trust. So I'm going to start off with looking at the locution A trusts B to C. I mean, there's other locutions you could focus on. You could look at a generalized notion of trust, where just A trust simpliciter. You could look at a trust that we can have invest in persons, A trust B, or you might feel that you need to contextualize it and think of A trust B to C in context D. I'm taking the three-place locution as basic because whilst we think of trust as fundamentally an attitude that we can have towards someone doing something, and I think that it's fundamentally an attitude, and we can have this attitude, we can trust someone to do something even without them doing anything. It's just simply an attitude. Our interest in trust lies in the fact that trust supports cooperation. So you rely on someone doing something because you trust them. And so insofar as our interest in trust is fundamentally because trust is a way of supporting cooperation, we should take the three-place locution as our basic analysans. If I've got the term to be analysed, we should take that to the basic term to be analysed, because we're interested in trust as a basis of cooperation, and We're interested in trust supporting particular instances of relying, and so we should focus on the attitude, which is the attitude we have towards somebody doing something. So the starting point of how we should think about trust then, I propose, is that we should think that trust is that attitude which grounds cooperation. It's that attitude which renders us willing to rely on other people doing things. So I think this is the basic function of trust. The basic function of trust is to facilitate, is to enable cooperation. It's to make it rational to rely on others. And then we focus on that three-place locution, a trust B to C, and trying to work out, well, how is it that we then understand this attitude which renders cooperation willing? And in giving an analysis, we're trying to give an excavation of our particular understanding of trust. And it might well be that there's some cultural variation going on here, and different people, when it came up in one of the other talks where someone asked, well, what do the Iraqis think about trust? And so I'm giving an excavation of our attitude, our idea of trust. But you might think that genealogically, every society has to solve the problem of cooperation. Every society has to make it rational for others to rely on one another. So every society is going to have an attitude like trust, which renders reliance rational, which enables cooperation. And so every society is going to have some trust-like attitude. And the way that what follows really is an excavation of how I think that we understand trust as that attitude which renders reliance willing and underpins cooperation. Okay, so a good starting point then is, let's look at an instance of trust, and I'll take a famous one, which I'm sure you're familiar of, which is Hume's farmers. And so we have farmer A and farmer B, they're neighbouring farmers, and the corn in one of the farmers' fields ripens first. He can't harvest the corn alone. He needs farmer B's help to harvest his corn. And so he asks farmer B to help with his harvest. And farmer B says, well, I'll help you with your harvest now if you promise to help me with my harvest later. And this, of course, would be the cooperative outcome. A would help B now, B would help A later. Both of them would end up with their harvest in the barn. So that's the cooperative outcome. It involves one person relying on another doing something, relying on them harvesting later. And if they trust them to harvest later, then that will secure the cooperative outcome. So the question then is, what reasons does A have for trusting that B will help later, or B have, sorry, for trusting A to help later. And the problem is that there's a risk involved in trust, because if B helps A now, A's got his harvest in the barn, and there's the risk now of the worst outcome, where A might now think, well, look, my harvest is in the barn, why should I bother labouring later? I mean, labouring is just pure cost. What is it in? What's in it for me to suffer this cost when my harvest is already in the barn? So you think that in order to reasonably rely, in order for it to be rational to lie, there needs to be some grounds for having the attitude of trust, if trust is going to be that attitude which renders reliance willing. So trust needs to be grounded because of the risk of the worst outcome. And a problem that Hume then pointed out is that there's a danger that if there isn't any reasons for having this attitude of trust, then both of them can lose their harvest for want of mutual confidence. They lose the harvest for want of having a positive belief that the other will prove reliable. Okay, in fact, of course, there's lots of reasons why the farmer B might trust farmer A to help him later. I mean, there's many, many reasons. So let's just outline a few. There might be friends. There might be informal sanctions in the forms of community judgment. Let's suppose that B helps A, and then A says, "I'm not helping you in return." I mean, he might be completely shunned and ostracized by the rest of the farming community. He might never be able to sell his corn because nobody might buy it from him. So there's going to be all forms of informal sanctions might be in play. They might elevate the promise to a form of a legal contract. They might be, B might not be happy with the mere promise. He might require that a sign on the dotted line that he'll help him now if he label him later. And then there might be formal sanctions for breach of contract. Or, as was mentioned in one of the talks, if you have an exchange iterated, then the fact that there's future possibilities of cooperation gives a reason for cooperating now, because B might think, well, if A doesn't help me when I need my harvest, I won't help him next year. And A might recognize, well, if I don't help him this year, he won't help me next year. So there's going to be costs in the long run for defection now. And so this kind of iteration would give a reason to cooperate. So there's all kinds of reasons why we might cooperate. Let me just focus in on the last one, because the last one, I think, it gives you a kind of guess at the kernel of things. So the last one is the idea of the reason emerges with a kind of iteration of harvests, is that it sees the one farmer forming the judgment that the other farmer will help on the basis that it lies in the other farmer's long-term interest to help. So trust is rendered rational because you've got grounds for believing the being cooperative lies in the other person's interest. So this is an analysis of trust that was also offered by Russell Harding. He said that trust is merely just encapsulated interest. So the attitude of trust is just a judgment. You can rely on someone doing something given that it's in their interest to do that thing. So your interest in them helping you also lies in their interest, given that they recognize that them helping you is a prerequisite of you helping them next year. Okay, so what we have here is we have lots of reasons enabling one farmer to judge that the other farmer would help. We have lots of reasons for making a judgment about possible outcome, and central in these reasons for forming a judgment about possible outcome is a judgment of interest. What lies in the interest of the other party? So in our ordinary interactions, we have many grounds for these kinds of judgments about outcome. What's interesting is that if you're in a situation of conflict, lots of the grounds that we have for forming a judgment that the other party will cooperate start to disappear. Right. So take the idea of friendship. If you're in a situation of conflict, then if the conflict is genuinely deep enough so that the friendship is threatened, then the reason of friendship is no longer going to be a reason you can appeal to. Or take the notion of informal sanctions. Again, if the conflict is deep enough, you're going to cease to care what the community thinks or for the operation of the sanctioning mechanisms. Or take the case of formal sanctions. Well, I mean, it's possible that you could the conflict isn't deep enough such that you still have confidence in the sanctioning mechanism, and so you might have trust in the sanctioning mechanism, and so you might have a kind of a second order trust in the sanctioning mechanism. So which means that even though you've got conflict with the party, you've got your faith in the sanctioning mechanism would now allow you to trust them because you could recognize that it's in their interest to avoid the sanctions. But again, if there's conflict, the fool's advice would seem to hold sway. And what the fool said is that if you can get away with, if the sanctions are imperfectly applied, and you can get away with actions such that the sanctions aren't applied, then you should. And whenever you can get away with doing something that you should. So when there's conflict, you're going to have a lot of faith in the sanctioning mechanisms if that's to provide a reason, because you can assume that the fool's advice is going to hold sway over the person you're in conflict with. So lots of the reasons disappear in the trust situation, in the conflict situation. But that's not to say that all of the reasons disappear, because the reason of self-interest still remains. Cooperation is still going to have an absolutely solid ground if cooperation is the best outcome for both parties, and if you can reason that it's in their self-interest to be cooperative. It's interesting to hear that some of the dilemmas of trust have it that cooperation is the best outcome, but defection is still a kind of a dominant choice. So I'm thinking that you need to have the cooperative strategy emerging as the strategy of self-interest here. And if you can construct a situation such that that is so, then even if the parties are completely in conflict and completely hate each other and couldn't be in the same room with one another or around the same negotiating table as one another, you can still have grounds for trust. So trust can emerge within conflict on this understanding of it. So that's the first conclusion then. So trust understood in terms of a subjective expectation about outcome that is consistent with conflict, and trust can emerge within conflict. Okay, so conflict, I think, reduces but doesn't eliminate the available grounds for trust, understanding trust in this way. The problem is, if we think about trust in terms of a subjective expectation about outcome, the belief that the other person will prove cooperative, the belief the other person can be relied upon. If we understand trust in this way, it's not merely conflict that reduces the grounds that we have for trusting others. In fact, in many situations, we're in a position of ignorance. In many situations, we just don't know whether or not the others will prove reliable. We don't know whether or not we do have grounds for relying on them. Our situation is often one of ignorance. So we often don't know whether the interaction is one-off or will continue. We don't know if it's got an indefinite end or will end at the next encounter. We don't know the motivations of the potential trustee. We don't know whether there's sanctions or whether the sanctions will be implemented. And in many situations, nevertheless, we still know that there's a worse outcome where trust exposes us to defection and trust exposes us to the risk that the other person, say for example, you're buying goods from somebody. There's always the risk that you'll give them money and they'll won't give you the goods, and you've never met them before. You're not going to meet them again. There's no sense that there's informal sanctions. You might not have confidence in formal ones. I mean, whilst we do have lots of grounds for trust, in many situations we're also remarkably ignorant. And so it seems that if you understand trust merely in these terms of a subjective expectation about outcome, you have to face the problem that in many situations we do not have the grounds for making a prediction. It seems that if we understand trust in this way, trust is overly fragile and easily lost. Cooperation becomes problematic to that extent. The problem is that this analysis of trust now faces is that societies are cooperative achievements. Societies are cooperation is endemic in society. It's defection which is the extraordinary occurrence, not cooperation. Cooperation isn't fragile. People cooperate with one another the whole time. People don't defect anywhere near as much as you would expect them to defect if trust were merely just a subjective expectation about outcome. And it seems, moreover, that people behave in trustworthy ways irrespective of what their interest is. People behave in trustworthy ways just because it's seen as the right thing to do. It's seen as people behave trustworthily just because it's they think that being trustworthy, they ought to be trustworthy. So let's go back to Hume's farmers for a second. So when A agrees to help B with the harvest, and A promises to help B with the harvest, and then B starts worrying, well, is his promise worth the bit of paper it isn't written on? I mean, if I was him, I would just, I'd be happy when my harvest was in the barn and then not help him at all. And if A found out that he was having these kinds of anxieties, he might feel upset. Surely you trust me, right? I promised to help you, right? It wouldn't occur to me not to help you, having you helped me. He might be indignant at the idea that he might reason to the kind of the lazy outcome as the best outcome. So people reason in terms of obligations and commitments and morality. And I think this comes up even in the games theoretical literature. So there's a trust game, which I'm sure you're familiar of, where one party gives another $10 that sum is multiplied by a factor of 3 or 4. So the recipient is then has $40 and the option of giving a back transfer. And so the game is to see how much money people give initially and then how much money people give back. And obviously the most cooperative outcome is for the first party to give the second party everything, and then the second party to split the windfall 50-50. And if that happens, then everyone is a winner. And then they do versions of the game where they introduce a punishment option, when the punishment option is that if the other party doesn't give back a what's deemed a kind of a suitable amount, then they have the option of paying more and inflicting a punishment on the non-cooperative party. And the way that the punishment option is run is that these are one-off exchanges. And so implementing a punishment option is not in your economic interest, because it just means that you lose more money. But nevertheless, people are indignant and universally utilize this punishment option. And that shows that there's an emotional response here, that people feel that there's an injustice being done, that there was a wrong being done to them. They feel that they've been wronged, and the appropriate response to being wronged is to being punished. And it shows that trust is very much embedded within a kind of a moral way of thinking, where the moral way of thinking is attached to notions of fairness, notions of obligation, notions of commitment. Okay, so we've got a different understanding of trust in play here. What's involved here is not so much a subjective expectation of outcome, but more a normative expectation. The expectation that somebody ought to help, particularly if they said that they would help, as in the case of the farmers and the promise. And notice that the normative, we can have normative expectations where we don't think that people will fulfill what we hold them to. So I can think that you ought to do something, and at the same time I think, well, because you're a very, very bad person, you're not going to do what you ought to do. And so having a normative expectation isn't sufficient itself to trust. So trust is rather having a normative expectation and at the same time thinking well of somebody. It's having a normative expectation and holding it optimistically. And this is why we saw in some of the earlier discussions this kind of reference to thinking about trust as a kind of an optimistic psychological state. So the way I would like to present it is that you hold somebody to an expectation, but nevertheless you think well of them in doing so. Because you think well of them in doing so, the expectation carries the presumption of its fulfillment. Okay, so the second way I think we understand trust is we understand it as an optimistic expectation of commitment fulfillment. And this is a thicker and more moral notion. And it's attached to a certain worldview, and a worldview where people make commitments to one another, and then we expect one another to honor the commitments that we have made to each other. And it's a notion of how people ought to be treated. So if I've made a commitment to you, the way that you ought to treat me is you ought to respond to my commitment with the expectation that I will honor it and a presumption that I will do so. And if you start to query my commitment, and if you start to kind of calculate the evidence as to whether or not I'm going to honor it, then you're not giving me the due respect that I'm owed as a commitment maker. Okay, so now let's go back to conflict. So if we're understanding trust in this more moralized term as a normative expectation, optimistically held, well, as soon as you're in a situation of conflict, the optimism is lost. And if the optimism is lost and you've merely got a normative expectation, well, that could be distrust as much as it could be trust, because you can hold someone to a normative expectation and think that they won't fulfill it. It's a way of distrusting them. Is to say, in fact, that you distrust them. So insofar as conflict entails a loss of optimism about the other meeting their commitments, well, then it entails distrust. In the sense that when you're in a situation of conflict, commitments don't mean anything. Right? If you're really in a situation of conflict, commitments aren't worth the paper they're not written on. Right? We need to start reasoning about things being in people's interest. It's in their interest to meet their commitment. Why should we just take their commitment as such if it's not in their interest to keep it? There's no presumption that people will do what they ought to do. So this is the second conclusion then. Conflict implies distrust. So we've got two conclusions. Conflict is consistent with trust, and conflict implies distrust. Those two conclusions are inconsistent with each other. And that's in fact because we've got two notions of trust in play. We've got trust as a subjective expectation about outcome. And this is the notion of trust which has dominated economics. And I think this is the notion of trust which is entirely viable and it's part of our thinking. But we've also got trust as a normative expectation of commitment fulfillment optimistically held. And this is the notion of trust, which has kind of dominated philosophical thinking. And I also think this is a very important notion of trust because it's attached to ideas about how we ought to treat one another, how the reasons that we give one another for doing things, by promising to you to do something, I give you a reason for thinking that I'm going to do something. I give you a certain normative hold over me. We give one another reasons by giving one another commitments. And this is all tied up with ideas of respecting others and seeing each other as equals. So I think both these notions of trust are essential. And I think both of them deserve to be notions of trust because trust fundamentally is that attitude which renders cooperation possible and renders reliance willing. It's a cooperation supporting attitude. Both of these expectations are ways of supporting cooperation. They both play a role in grounding cooperation. They just operate in different contexts. It's rational to cooperate if you have a subjective belief about outcome. If you think the other will prove reliable, that renders cooperation reasonable. And it's rational to cooperate if you have an expectation of others optimistically held. If you presume that they will do what they say they will do, that presumption makes it rational to cooperate with them. So trust is that attitude which renders cooperation willing. But in fact, when you tease it apart, there's two attitudes which render cooperation willing, and there's two notions of trust. One of these notions of trust, I think, is entirely consistent with conflict, and I'd be interested to see the kinds of connections the project can work out in this regard. The other notion of trust, I think, is inconsistent with conflict, and my proposal is you go down one avenue rather than another there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Paul. Brilliant. While Paul is joining us from Sheffield, which I forgot to say, we're fortunate to have two ConTrust colleagues on this panel. The first is Chiara Destri, who is a member of the brilliant postdoc group that we are happy to have here at ConTrust. She is a democratic theorist and works on political realism, received her PhD in Milan, and then we are fortunate to have her after fellowships, including a Marie Curie at Sciences Po, that she joined us here. She has published on questions of democratic legitimacy and disagreement in very fine journals like Res Publica, like in Ethical Theory and Moral Practice, where she has a piece on the sources of political normativity. She also has an excellent paper on democratic politics and the circles of trust in an edition recently published called Trust Matters, Cross-Disciplinary Essays, edited by Baradas de Freitas and Sergio Iacono. And we will actually have an occasion to discuss the pieces in that book with the authors in 2 weeks' time at a workshop Chiara is organizing. A working paper is about to be published in the ConTrust series on political trustworthiness, and the title of our talk today is Electoral Democracy and the Duty of Trust.
Great. Okay, so well, first of all, thank you very much, and thanks to Rainer for the very kind introduction. I'm not entirely sure the approach I take in this paper is fully consistent with the main thrust of ConTrust. So I just want to flag that out. And since this is a very early draft, all comments and objections are particularly welcome. Okay, so electoral democracy and the duty of trust. The reasons behind this paper are the following. So we've seen that distrust and polarization seem to foster each other in a perverse dynamic, according to which little trust in government increases polarization, which in turn decreases trust in government. And this has, I think, a double effect on the electoral process. On the one hand, citizens have little trust in the office holders elected through elections, but citizens also tend to distrust less their fellow citizens because they are seen as incompetent and in bad faith. And we know that there is plenty of literature in political science testifying to that. As a result, not only citizens are less inclined to comply with government directives, but they're also less inclined to see electoral results as legitimate and acceptable when they disagree. So given this problem, the question that I'm going to ask and the structure of the presentation is the following. So basically, do citizens have a duty to trust their fellow citizens as voters? First of all, I will try to say something about what it means to trust, and then what it means to be trustworthy, and I will go through 3 different theories, and then what it means to be trustworthy as voters. And I will try to offer 4 reasons in favor of a duty of trust. 3 are instrumental and 1 is non-instrumental. Okay, good. First of all, a few things about trust in conflict. I wanted to say that it seems to me that there are at least 3 ways of bringing about trust in the face of conflict. And this is also some of the things that I've understood from this annual conference. So first of all, we can work on individual trustworthiness. So by making other citizens trustworthy in the relevant matters, we make citizens' trust justified. And so this is, from what I understand, this is part of the approach of ConTrust. So the point is to make trust justified and not simply to say that trust is a good thing or a bad thing, all things considered. The second option is to work on institutional trustworthiness. So by making institutions trustworthy, we lower the risk and potential vulnerability that citizens experience in trusting others. But I think that there is a third approach, which is the one that I try to employ here, that is working on individual trust. So are there circumstances in which it is citizens themselves who should strive to trust others? And so it's not simply whether and to what extent citizens have a duty to be trustworthy, which I think is important, but also whether and to what extent citizens might have a duty to strive to trust other fellow citizens. So first of all, we should trust our fellow citizens. This unqualified statement is problematic, and I see a lot of perplexed faces. So how can we trust people when we don't know, well, first of all, with what and how, right? So the structure of the concept of trust that I'm using here follows Rainer Forst's working paper in our ConTrust working paper series, and that is that A trusts B in the context C with valued thing D. So the thing that I'm like the concept of trust I'm focusing on here is A, each of us should trust B, all other fellow citizens in the political electoral context and with the exercise of their voting rights. So the type of trust I'm interested in is political rather than social. It is horizontal rather than vertical, and it is generalized rather than particularized or simply interpersonal. Importantly, it is not generalized all the way. So it's not generalized in Uslaner's sense. It is generalized because it is only generalized with the object of trust in the sense of other people, other citizens. But it is not generalized with the task of trust, with the valued thing D, right? So I'm not saying that we should trust our fellow citizens full stop, but with a specific task that is the exercise of their voting rights. So the question is, should we? Can we? Well, first take, if we think of trust as a cognitive or predictive concept, if we have a predictive or cognitive conception of trust, trust is primarily a belief. So this statement, we should trust our fellow citizens as voters, make really little sense, I think. A trusts B in context C with respect to D if A has a belief that B is trustworthy in that context and with respect to that responsibility or task. So evidentialist epistemology tells us that a belief is justified if and only if there is a sufficient evidence in favor of holding that belief. And the belief that my fellow citizens are trustworthy as voters seems to lack appropriate evidence. On the one hand, we have literature, as I said, on voter ignorance, and on the other hand, there is growing polarization characterized by anger, partisan bias, and motivated reasoning. So it seems that we have very little evidence for having the belief that our fellow citizens are trustworthy as voters. And if the belief is unjustified, also trust is unjustified as a result. So I cannot have a duty to trust fellow citizens if my trust is unjustified, and I cannot simply decide to trust at will if trust is a belief, right? But there is a second take, and that is an effective conception of trust. So rather than a belief, trust can also be considered as primarily an attitude of optimism or a normative expectation coupled with that attitude of optimism. And in this case, A trusts B with D, if and only if A is optimistic that B will take care of D in the appropriate way. So the attitude goes together with the expectation, but the latter is grounded in the former. So it's not grounded in evidence. As John says, emotions are partly constituted by patterns of salience and tendencies of interpretation, and therefore trusting is analogous to blinkered vision by giving rise to selective interpretations about others. So trusting is more hoping than predicting, and therefore it is outside of the scope of evidentialist epistemology. So trust cannot be willed, also in this case, but it can be cultivated. We can, again, quoting Jones, we can will to pay attention to the kind of things that are likely to support, create, or extend our trust. And we can will to refrain from focusing on the kinds of things that are likely to undermine and limit our trust. So by trusting, we contribute to the creation of the conditions that justify our trust. So if this makes sense, a first qualification of the firmer statement, we should trust our fellow citizen, is the following. We should strive to maintain an attitude of optimism towards our fellow citizens. Trust means accepting vulnerability, willingly rely on others, and refrain from constantly monitoring them. So if it is possible to strive to maintain this attitude of optimism, the question is with respect to what exactly? And as I said, I was thinking about citizens as trustworthy voters. So the structure of the concept of trustworthiness is the following. B is trustworthy with respect to D if B is competent and willing to take care of D. There are three ways to cash out the willingness part. So first of all, there is the competence part, but the willingness part can be understood in different ways. One is Hardin's theory of encapsulated interest. So basically, B is trustworthy when B's interests encapsulate A's. But the problem is that it requires thick relationships and fails to account for cases of generalized trust. The second option is moral motivation. So B is trustworthy when B shows goodwill towards A, being moved by traits such as benevolence, integrity, or honesty. Now, the problem is that it fails, I think, to accommodate disagreement and conflict, while there are cases in which we do trust our adversaries and our opponents. So the third option that I go for is commitment theory. And so basically the idea that B is trustworthy when B is committed to D. So the motivations behind the commitment don't matter as long as the commitment has been taken and B is able and willing to meet it. So the second qualification of the former sentence that I had was we should strive to maintain an attitude of optimism that our fellow citizens are committed to exercising their voting rights appropriately. So it's an optimism about our fellow citizens' capacity to exercise their voting rights. Now, what does appropriately means, of course? So the context is the context of democratic elections. So I'm thinking about democratic elections and countries, liberal democracies, where you have more or less working system of democratic elections. Elections are cooperative. They are constituted by certain rules that all competing parties must respect. So citizens can trust each other to be equally committed to the respect of these democratic rules. But elections are also competitive and adversarial. So candidates and parties compete for citizens' vote by offering diverse and often incompatible programs based on diverse and often incompatible values. So citizens cannot trust each other to vote for the same party or to have a similar view of justice or the common good. So the valued thing D is the task of exercising their voting rights. And the idea is that political disagreement and partisanship requires us to see that we have, again, different views of justice and the common good. And so we cannot expect our fellow citizens to share our views. So trusting someone doesn't require full agreement, I think. It depends on the things one is entrusted with. And the minimal conception that I have in mind here of appropriate voting is that citizens vote appropriately. So they are trustworthy as voters when they respect the rule of the game and when they are responsive to reasons. So when these two conditions are fulfilled, citizens can be considered trustworthy voters. So the third qualification in the paper is the following: we should strive to maintain an attitude of optimism that our fellow citizens are committed to respect electoral rules and be responsive to reasons in their voting. This is a default position. So I'm not saying that citizens ought to strive in such a way in all, like, against available evidence, right? I'm just saying this is a default position that they should have when they interact with each other. But of course, this default position can be falsified by evidence. So if this is the qualification of the statement that I have in mind, the question now is it justified? Why should we do that? And I try to offer 4 reasons. So the first 3 are instrumental reason. There is something called therapeutic trust. So the idea is that trusting others is sometimes needed to help them develop their capacity to be trustworthy. So if that is true, by trusting our fellow citizens, we may contribute to a climate of reciprocal trust and help them develop their capacity to make sensible decisions at the voting booths. The second possible instrumental reason is what Pettit calls the cunning of trust. So even if people are not trustworthy, they often are trust responsive. So they take the trust that others show them as a compelling reason to act as they are trusted, for instance, out of reasons of reputation and self-esteem. And so by showing trust, we can activate a trust responsive attitude, which in turn justifies our trust. And then a third reason is that trusting fellow citizens is necessary to jointly keep an eye on government officials, towards whom a default attitude of mistrust and vigilance can be more justifiable. And then there is another reason that I think it's non-instrumental. And I think that it basically is the idea that we should respect our fellow citizens as co-rulers. So all democratic citizens are entrusted with equal voting rights, and respecting you in the exercise of your political agency means that I should have a default position of optimism that you are committed to exercising these rights appropriately. As a default position, this attitude of trust cannot be kept against evidence to the contrary, but it requires that we refrain from continuously monitoring fellow citizens in the exercise of their voting function. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Brilliant. Our last, not least speaker is Michael Kosfeld, who is not just known among economists for his work generally and his work on trust in particular, but also in other disciplines and quarters, because his work crosses these disciplines at many points, and we're very happy that he also does so in the ConTrust context. He's a professor at the Faculty of Economics and Business here at Goethe University and holds the chair of Organization and Management. He's also director of the Frankfurt Laboratory for Experimental Economic Research and the Center for Leadership and Behavior in Organizations, coordinator of the SAFE, which is another Leibniz Institute here on campus, the SAFE Experiment Center here in Frankfurt. He, among his publications, you will see why I said that they cross disciplines. Think of a paper in the American Economic Review from 2005, Neuroeconomic Foundations of Trust and Social Preference. As you know, in neuroscience, affective relations, emotions, and attitudes, trust among them play an important role. So he crosses that boundary. He crosses another boundary in a paper published the same year in Nature, which is called Oxytocin. Sorry, oxytocin is the German word. Increases trust in humans, co-authored with great colleagues like Ernst Fehr. He has another paper on distrust, the hidden cost of control, in the American Economic Review, a paper on can you trust the good guys, trust within and between groups with different missions. This, I think, already foreshadows what he's going to do today. Lots of other papers, including Trust the Police, ? Self-selection of motivated agents into the German police force, with co-authored with another ConTrust colleague, Guido Friebel. So, Michael, we're very much looking forward to the talk today, which, if I get it right in English, would be thinking rationally and listening to each other.
Well, thanks, Rainer, for the introduction. Thanks, ConTrust, and everybody here for the hospitality and listening to what I'm going to say. I created expectations when you asked me about the title that I now hope I can deliver, at least to some extent, because when you ask me what's the title, I realized that I do not have a title for the paper I'm going to present here, but only something I wanted to start with. This is what you see here. So I just took this as the title, which is Rational Denken und einander zuhören. It was on the last weekend in the FAZ. It had a piece about this conference, Falling Walls, which is about science, communication of science to politics, to outside world. And in one of the articles in that supplement here, it just argued, well, in the end, it's just everything about rational denken and einander zuhören, and everything is fine, right? So just rational thinking and listening to each other, and then there's no problem, right? So I thought, well, that's exactly the key starting point for what I think I could present here within that ConTrust conference, where I have to admit, although I see many connections to the papers that were given before, also the way how I present things now, which will be much more, let's say, simple things, on simple evidence, on simple results that we do in our experiments, and not as broad, and actually combining many things, nevertheless contributes something. So why do I start with this rational thinking and listening to each other if it could only be so simple? Because the problem is we may not listen to each other, right? We may not listen to each other. And why don't we do that? Because to some extent, this listening to each other also requires a form of trust. It forms of a trust that we get into exchange, social exchange, information exchange, where I need to trust the other party. And in particular, I also need to trust that the information another party has is of value. It's of value that I should listen to and that I should take into account, right? And this may not be there. So this trust may not exist, may not emerge, may disappear. And this is something where our study contributes. So what I want to present here today are results from an ongoing project. Some of you have seen already in some teasers and some workshop presentations, which I think fits nicely to this question of conflict and trust here. It's about information exchange. It's about learning and the role of group and social identity in this all endeavor, right? How social identities affect the way how we are willing to learn from each other and engage in information exchange. Now, we're all part of different groups, right? You can define groups of who we think we are. Like I'm an economist, for example. There's a group of economists, and this makes me member of some group, but I also have opinions. I believe I may have political opinions some of you share and some don't, and that may make us part of different groups where we disagree about different things. And this is exactly the context where our study takes place, and where I think that studying the form of trust between these different groups is potentially of most productive for this whole project of ConTrust. So our studies take place, and I have to admit, it's doesn't work here. No, okay. So it takes place in a particular country, which has been studied very often, and is studied very often also by economists because there's lots of data out there. But for our study here, I like this country in particular because it's a very interesting case for polarization at the present time, right? So our studies takes place in the political world of the US. And we ask the question, how does partisan group identity, and I will tell you how we capture this and how we operationalize this, how we measure it, influence opinion and belief formation. And we did an online experiment over 3 waves starting in November 2020 until November 21. We started just 1 week before the last presidential election. So the first wave where we asked, we did a survey experiment. We did this survey experiment was just before the election. The second wave was after the inauguration of Joe Biden in January 21, and the third wave was then in November 21. And it's work in progress with 3 colleagues, Kevin Bauer from SAFE here, and Florian Head from Mainz, and Yan Chen from the University of Michigan. And in this project, in total, we actually separate very carefully between information demand, so people can demand for information processing. I will today focus, oops, this should be down, on information demand. So I will not focus on Kosfeld. This is what you need to focus on now. No, I will focus. So this happens when you move from Mac to Windows always. So we'll see what happens with the rest of the slides. So far it goes fine. Okay. But since this panel is also called Trust Reconsidered, let me emphasize to what extent this work compared to existing work in economics, and some of this has been already, and I'm very grateful for that, also discussed by the speakers before. Our research differs in 2 important dimensions. The first is our study studies trust in information exchange and not allocation decisions. So in that sense, we don't use the trust game that has been used in so many studies before as the paradigm for creating cooperation in the form of social exchange and economic exchange, where it is about resource generation, right? So you can actually increase the pie by trusting or cooperating and sharing it. This will not be our paradigm. It's a bit different one. And we focus on something that I think economists have a bit neglected in the past. It's really on information. So, and the second thing where we differ from existing approaches in economics is that in our setup, actually, trust, as you will see it, will be rational. Trust is a thing that we should expect to be there, and we study deviations from this. And this is also not the typical economic approach. The typical economic approach is like also what we saw in the first paper, is like, in a sense, economists are experts for studying trust emerging in conflict, right? Because we have this self-interested homo economicus who is not willing to have any empathy with others, not cooperating. And nevertheless, this ego type is willing to trust sometimes, right? Because we have repeated interactions, we have other things. So the typical approach is that we study a situation where there's no trust. So there's a clear equilibrium without trust, without cooperation. Then we want to see, okay, what can we do such that the new equilibrium with trust actually emerges? And this is not what we do. We actually want to identify things that make us not trust each other, although we could, right? And see what are the channels and the variables that play a role. So let me go into details and be a bit more concrete. How do we measure group identity here in this world that we analyze, and how do we define the word that I will use now very often in the following, called groupiness? Somebody's groupie or not groupie. Actually, we use existing work from behavioral economics that also has started, as often economists, I think I like the discipline a lot, but they are very good in taking things out of other disciplines and then working with them and putting this into their literature and then pushing it forward. So this did not come, of course, out of economics, but social psychology. Teifel and others were the first to identify that actually social identity is an important thing here, but it entered economics and brought interesting results. So here we identify group identity, or let's say heterogeneity, in the way how people identify with their group based on behavior. This is the economic approach. So we're very skeptical about just asking people. We want to see how they behave. So we let them split $6, real dollars. This is real money that is paid out between two people they do not know, but they only know that one is a member of the Democratic group, and the other one is a member of the Republican group. Now, what does these groups mean? It means actually in the survey we ask, are you a Democrat or are you Republican? And if you say, well, I'm neither, I'm independent, we force you to please tell us to which group do you feel more aligned, right? And then you are part of the Democratic group or the Democrat group or the Republican group. And you can split the $6 here by just choosing person 1 and 5 to the other, or 2 and 4, or 3 and 3 and 4 and 2 and the other way around. So you could split equally, or you favor one of these members, right? That's political group identity. Then we take minimal group identity, which has been I think we really put it to the extremes. It has also been used in social psychology, where they take arbitrary groups, but here it's really arbitrary groups and randomly assigned. You don't choose whether you are a circle or a triangle, but we tell you, you're a member of the circle group, you're a member of the triangle group, everybody's a member of one of these groups. And now you also are asked to allocate these $6, another $6 between two other members of these different groups, right? Now, what do we see here in these allocation behaviors? And this is how we then define groupiness. We call in-group favoritism groupiness. So somebody is groupie if he allocates more than 50% to an in-group participant. You can be politically groupie if you favor your political party member, or minimally groupie if you favor your triangle member, if you're just by chance a member of the triangle group, right? Now, what do we see here? You see here roughly 60% of participants are politically groupie. So they show in-group favoritism in the political domain. And if you go to the minimal world, and I still find this astonishing, I still can't believe that this is true, but it comes up and again in these studies. You have here, like, not the exact number, but a substantial share, and here's 37% of participants are minimally groupie, right? So even in these arbitrary groups, they react to this by giving more to their group member, who they do not know anything about, right? This is all, both are anonymous, right? So this is there. And the other thing I just want to emphasize here, which is important for our things for the things that I tell later, they overlap largely, right? So political groupiness and minimal groupiness. 80% of the minimally groupie are also politically groupie. So there should be a groupie, but in this version, it's hidden behind the graph. So, and if you do a prediction analysis to predict who is politically groupie, being minimally groupie is the best predictor, right? So politically groupie people have many characteristics, but being minimally groupie seems to be the key. So there is something which suggests that there's actually some trait dimension of being groupie in here. Okay, so this is what we do here. And then first wave, we ask in the political domain, how do people demand information? So what do? We ask them in the end, please tell us, what do you think will be the state of the economy a year from then, right? So in 21, how would be unemployment rate? So this is one where they ask their beliefs. So they shall give us their belief, where will be unemployment in the US if Biden wins or if Trump wins, right? So they shall get some information. They can give us a prior, they can give us a posterior. So we ask them to make guesses, to form beliefs and opinion about an important political question here, right? The one first is unemployment. We have another outcome domain, which is public health system. And again, depending on Biden winning or Trump winning, you can make your guess. And you either say, to make it easy, we tell them, look, this is where the US was then. It was 7.9% was unemployment in 2020. And then we asked them, what do you think it would be an improvement or a strong improvement or a decline or whatever? So to make it easy, because nobody would probably know what to say if you don't give them the information. They get paid again. So for every correct prediction, they get $10 in our study here. And now, in order to study information demand, we tell them, now you can get them information. So we ask the prior, but they can give us posteriors. So it can tell us what do they think after they read something about the economy, about health, right? So we produced articles. So we curated 2 articles on the economy or on health, depending on where they were in. And the information sources were either left-leaning, neutral, or right-leaning. Right? And left-leaning would be, for example, New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC. Right-leaning would be, for example, Fox News, Washington Examiner, Wall Street Journal. Right? And then we put these articles together, and you would see the title. I show you a page here. Importantly, these articles actually contain the same facts, same length, but it's just different slant. Right? It's coming from the different outlets, and therefore has different slants. Now, what we ask people to do is they give us their willingness to pay for reading either this or that article. Right? So the default is any of these articles will be given to you with 50% probability, but now you can invest money to read one and not read the other article. And you can increase the probability of reading your preferred article, meaning to avoid the other article, by spending money. And every 10% increase costs $1, right, in this study. So this is how it's done. For example, for health, these would be the 2 articles. You see There's one, here is the left article coming from Fox News, so it's right-leaning. And the title is Trump's healthcare plan puts the patient where Obamacare didn't first. And the other one would be a more neutral one, what the United States might look like after the election for key health issues. Right? And you either see this or that, and you can now flip, you can switch the, with this here, you can adjust the probability to read either this or read either that, right? And that is our outcome measure for information demand. So what do you want to read, or what do you want to avoid, right? And what we see is this. So this is the money spent in percentage of the endowment they have for party congenial info, right? So that would be, if it's neutral versus outgroup, you avoid the outgroup, you want the neutral. If it's in-group versus neutral, you want the in-group, right? So these are the two cases which they see. And what we basically see here is where the music plays is neutral versus outgroup, right? Those, they spend money to avoid the outgroup information, right? And both Democrats and both Republicans do it. And what you see here, what is the separate? The light bar are the politically non-groupie, and the dark bars are the politically groupie, right? So the people who show in-group favoritism in the political domain actually spend significantly more money on not reading the article from the other political group, right? Now, one treatment we did here is we took away the labels, right? So we took away these parts here, right? So they just saw the text. This actually is effective because it reduces this year, so the willingness of the groupie people actually to the level down of the non-groupie people. So making it less salient where these comes from actually can have an effect in terms of your information demand, which might be some instrument also to be used in practice. But this was just my starting point, because with this evidence, which we found interesting, there's still some problems, right? Because first, people may hold different beliefs about the quality of in and out group information, right? So you might perhaps rightly believe that it doesn't make sense to read Fox News. That you say, well, I want to read Nature instead. This is much more relevant. So people might have subjectively rational beliefs here about the different quality. Also, in this context, it's very different to define the rational benchmark. What is the rational benchmark that you should do, right? Given that these beliefs could differ and actually can be rationalized. Next, political groupiness, as I said, may capture many, many things, right? So why I show in-group favoritism in the political domain may actually have more elements than just being groupie. And this all shows, once again, that if you do field experiments or experimental studies like this in the natural context, there are very quickly limits of what you can do. So the advantage of us experimental economists is also we can go to the lab. So we do the same thing here now with the same people in the second wave, but take an abstract domain, right? So we move now to an abstract or neutral domain where there's no conflict. And again, I'm sorry to I apologize that everything has been moved around here in terms of my figures. So we move to a domain in which the beliefs about the quality of information can be controlled, right? And where there's no disagreement in particular, so there's no conflict about what you need to form beliefs about. That's the first thing. And the second is we don't use political groupiness, but we use minimal groupiness as the core of now seeing whether this group identity differences actually explain variation. So what do? We go to this task. This was in the second wave. We let everybody guess. We play, in a sense, play a game. So guess which cup is used. So there are two cups with different mixes of 3 colored marbles. And there's a green cup. It has 2 green marbles and 1 yellow. And there's a yellow cup which has 2 yellow marbles and 1 green, right? And each of these is chosen with probability with 50%. You don't know which one it is, but you can draw a marble. You can draw a marble, you look at it, and then you need to make a guess. What do you think it is? What's the rational thing here? Of course, if you draw a green marble, the probability that this comes from the green marble is higher. So you should, from the green cup, right? So you should guess it's the green cup if you see a green marble. Basically, you should just say the color you see. So it's Bayesian updating for dummies, right? It's really very, very simple, as you should do it. Now, importantly, everybody did this in the first wave. And we did it because we wanted to see whether people are Bayesian updaters or not, or whether whether the groupie people are stupid, or whether they do these simple things. They're not. everybody can do this. Now we use this in the second wave to have this as the very abstract natural domain to play around in terms of whether people want to see other people's guesses or not to make a good guess for their cup, right? So now, depending on the situation, as I will show you, participants now see either guesses of other participants, or they learn the color of one randomly drawn marble they draw themselves, right? And they can, again, influence what they do. So here, for example, we ask them, like you saw before, whose guesses do you want to see? And you can either, you have two Democrats or one Democrat and one Republican, right? And they both had the same cup in the first wave, so all four, right? Everybody faced the same situation. They drew a marble and they made a guess. And now we will tell you what the guesses were, and based on these guesses, you have to make your guess. So you can't draw a marble yourself, but you need to choose, okay, on whom shall I rely? So shall I rely on two Democrats, or shall I rely on one Democrat and one Republican? And we had all mixtures, right? So you also had two Democrats and two Republicans, right? And you just had to, again here, like you would determine the probability whether you would either have this or that. If you don't spend any money, then it's 50-50. Another situation was that you can draw a marble yourself, or you rely on somebody else, right? And the other buddy was either a Republican or a Democrat. Now, hier ist rational denken und einander zuhören. Now, changing probabilities is costly, right? So if you're rational and you believe the other person has made a correct guess, you should not spend any money, right? Because look, what should a rational person do here? This person draws a marble, sees the color, and tells you the color of the marble, right? So you get exactly the same information that you draw yourself, but just listening to somebody else. There's nothing that you can do. There's no benefit itself by you drawing a marble, right? There's also no benefit by discriminating between different people. Of course, if you believe that some people just cannot make it and are unable, are stupid, so they will not be able to make the right guess, you may have a reason. So here comes now the trust in. Do I trust that somebody from the other party is actually as able to make a good guess on this? And am I willing to listen to this? Do I want to see this guess compared to the situation where I have a co-partisan? So is my trust, my willingness to actually to pay for a guess from my co-partisan higher than one from the opposite party? That's actually what we now study. Now, so again, avoidance of off-group information in the abstract context now, wave 2. And this is what we find. So this is the percentage of participants who avoid out-group guesses. So this is guesses versus guesses, right? So whenever there is an out-group member, so if you're a Democrat and there's in these two guesses, there's a Republican, you avoid that. You spend money of not seeing these two guesses because the alternative is more in line with your group membership. So overall 20%, but you see again, the big difference between two subgroups, but now these are the minimally groupie and the minimally non-groupie. So the ones who show in-group favoritism in the circle and triangle task actually are willing to spend significantly more money to, as a Democrat, not see the guess of a Republican, right? So this is, in a sense, the first evidence I actually saw or have seen here on this groupiness or the identity here, the way how people incorporate this us versus them thinking into their way, how they actually demand information and trust each other's in this context. If you look at the marble, where you can draw your marble yourself, so it's not between two guesses, but the alternative is you draw marble yourself, you see similar results. The difference between minimally groupie and non-groupie is smaller, but it's still, there's a difference. It's still about 20% of all participants who are willing to spend a marble. Now you could think, and then I'm done, probably people hold different beliefs about the quality of information, right? So that Republicans think, well, Democrats don't get it, and the other way around. So we did a treatment. No, before I do a treatment, we asked them, so do you believe that basically our co-partisans are smarter? Right, so we didn't, but that's actually the question that we asked. So not in that formulation, but we asked them, what do you think? What's the share of people who get it correctly, right? So, and then we see actually what overall, like 40% almost, people believe that co-partisans are smarter than the others. But the minimally groupie, again, are more likely to say this, right? So groupiness also correlates with this, that you hold beliefs which now can rationalize that you behave in that way. Therefore, the treatment, we tell them that's wrong. Actually, the opposite party is equally smart. So we tell everybody that, and it's true because there's no difference in Republicans and Democrats in solving this simple task. So we tell them, so what's the treatment effect? There's a treatment effect in terms of whose guesses do you want? It goes down. So you see the left is again the overall effect. So so light bar is now the baseline and the dark one is the treatment. And you see there's a significant decrease in the willingness to avoid outgroup guesses. And it's all coming from the groupie people. So the minimally groupie are now, so if you correct their beliefs, actually they are less willing to spend money. Still, it's higher than in the non-groupie ones, as you can see. The non-groupie don't react, they are low anyway, and the minimally groupie still remain at a higher level. Final slide here is that if the comparison is you draw a marble yourself, there's no treatment effect. So even if you correct beliefs, people still spend as much money as before on not seeing the guess of an outgroup party. Right? So there's no effect there. Thanks. I'm done.